Now joining us here in the studio, Labor MP Michelle Ananda-Rajah. Welcome back, Michelle. And Liberal MP Bridget Archer. Bridget, welcome to you too. Yes, we will come back to Julian Assange, but why don't we start out on a substantial and substantive issue, tax. So stage 3 tax cuts have sailed through the House today. Where does that leave us on further tax reform, in your mind, Michelle, including things like negative gearing and capital gains tax?
Sure. Hi, Greg. It's great to be back. Hi, Bridget. I think, look, we are really pleased that the stage 3 tax cuts, the reform to that, Labor's tax cuts now, have gone through the lower house. As you know, the cost of living problem that we face has been much more persistent and sustained than we had hoped for. It's been a stubborn problem, and we had to intervene because people are doing it tough. So this tax agenda that we're pushing through now, with this being, I guess, the centrepiece, is really going to put real money into people's pockets to help them with their bills. In terms of broader tax reform, I mean, this is a discussion that happens every term of Parliament, and it's been kicking around for a long time. From our perspective, we have a broad tax agenda. We are tackling multinational tax, reform to the PRRT to claw back money from big oil and gas, and we've also made changes to build to rent in order to encourage the building of housing, which is desperately needed in this country. In terms of negative gearing and capital gains, these are two issues that were taken to two previous elections, 2016, 2019, and they were voted down by the Australian people. So we have no plans to re-prosecute this. We have no plans to reheat these policies.
No plans. Does that mean never touch them?
Never touch them? Well, look, that's speculative. That's something for a future government, but certainly our government is not going to be looking at these two. No.
All right. Where do you stand on that, Bridget Archer? I mean, stage 3 is what it is. I mean, it's sailing through the Parliament. The same will happen on the strength of coalition numbers in the Senate. What happens next about a tax system which many economists and experts will tell us, and as Michelle says, have been telling us for years, can do with substantial reform?
Well, certainly I'm personally very open-minded to the idea of tax reform. And I think Michelle sort of makes the important point, though, which is how, I feel about stage 3 as well. I said over 6 months ago that I was certainly open to having that discussion. But I think it is disappointing that the government hasn't telegraphed that better on the way through. And I think that leads to the speculation that Michelle was talking about, that people say, well, you went to an election last time saying that you were going to support the stage 3 tax cuts as were legislated. Now, I think it's okay to change your mind, but I think that should have been telegraphed well in advance of the point in which that announcement was made, because even, a week or so out, there were no plans to change. So I think that is what does lead people to be sceptical about the things that we say, and I personally am open to the idea of reform, but I'm also open to the idea that politicians start to communicate better with our electorate.
I understand that, and when you say reform, that would be inclusive of these property investor taxes?
Look, I think it's reasonable that anything is on the table for discussion, but where you ultimately land, who knows? But I think the important part is we shouldn't shy away from having a discussion about these things. You never move anything forward if you don't have a discussion. But then ultimately, I think, as Michelle has said, maybe if you're proposing wholesale reform, then you take it to an election and you let people decide.
All right. And that's standard operating procedure, is it? In your own mind anyway, Michelle Ananda-Rajah, no midterm changes of position. This was one. Stage 3 was one, but you're saying that couldn't apply, shouldn't apply
I think
to anything else.
Yeah, I think the circumstances around the tax cuts are very different. I mean, we threw a bunch of medicine at this problem, this cost of living problem, $23 billion worth of medicine. And it's helped people, but they are still calling for more relief. So we can't, as a government, in good faith, sit on our hands and say we can't do any more when we know we can. So we had to intervene in this circumstance. Now, I think With respect to other tax reform, I've laid out what we are doing, and I think that's a very full agenda for this term. Yeah. Absolutely.
All right, look, I might throw this one back in your direction, Michelle Ananda-Rajah. You're probably aware about the heightened language and warnings around this planned Israeli ground invasion of Rafah. Penny Wong has used some very stern words today, and the Prime Minister joined with the Prime Ministers of New Zealand and Canada to warn of catastrophic consequences if it goes ahead. A policy question that flows from this for Australia is, should its funding pause of the Palestinian Refugee Agency, UNRWA, be lifted very soon, almost immediately, in view of this possibly catastrophic ground campaign?
So firstly, we are very concerned about the situation unfolding in the southern part of Gaza. It is a worsening humanitarian crisis. There are over 1 million people who are now crammed into a very small area. They are facing not just starvation but possibly famine, and there's a risk of infectious diseases outbreaks which could in fact cause a level of casualties that will eclipse what has actually happened during the military campaign. And those concerns are legitimate, and we have conveyed them to the Israeli government. With respect to UNRWA, there are some pretty serious allegations that have been laid against UNRWA, which they acknowledge, and they are working through an investigation. And I think it's entirely appropriate, while that investigation continues, that we pause a portion of funding. Now, it's important to note we haven't cut UNRWA's funding. We have actually dispersed its core funding, which is $20 million, and we've withheld a small amount of funding until we find out the outcome of this investigation. But I'll also say that UNRWA is, for all its problems and its faults, and it has many, is still the only organisation on the ground that has the capability and the capacity to disperse the kind of aid that is needed at speed and at scale.
That's the bind, isn't it, Bridget Archer? It's got some troubles, certainly does, but it also might be, if fully resourced, the only agency able to deal with what could be a catastrophe here. What are your thoughts on either the ground invasion or the UNRWA funding question?
Well, I think, I'd agree with much of what Michelle has said in terms of, I think that we're all watching on with horror at what has, been unfolding in recent months in that area and the growing humanitarian disaster that is unfolding there. This funding to UNRWA was, urgent humanitarian assistance. Now, it is important that there is accountable, transparent, accountability for that funding. So pausing that while that is determined is appropriate. And whilst I respect that they are probably the best placed in terms of delivering the funding in the way that was articulated, given that it is urgent and it is growing, if there's going to be a protracted delay in determining whether that funding can be dispersed through UNRWA, the government may need to look at whether or not humanitarian aid can be dispersed through Red Cross or Red Crescent or others.
Yeah. It might explain...
To do something.
Yeah, it might explain why the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister are escalating their language to head off this sort of triggering catastrophe if that ground invasion goes ahead. Julian Assange, Bridget, you did join with Michelle and others in supporting the motion around Julian Assange at about this time yesterday in the House. Are you disappointed more coalition figures who we know publicly support the Assange campaign didn't join you?
Look, I think it would have been ideal and what the co-conveners of the Parliamentary Friends Group were hoping to achieve by way of the motion was to have, hopefully, a unanimous motion. And that's always difficult in here, particularly by way of suspension motions, because people become concerned or preoccupied with particular aspects of it or the language. We couldn't come to terms on that, but I think the result is the right one. I mean, 2/3 of the Australian Parliament voting on this motion, which is, I think, important to note, quite rare for a suspension of standing orders to be successful, and then for the substantive motion to be successful with the support of the government. I think that is a really quite a momentous occasion. So I'm pleased with that outcome, and I also think that, as Gabe Shipton has said, there has been strong support in a multi-partisan way, and people have backed that up with their public statements, including Leader of the Opposition, Peter Dutton, which I think is also really important. Now, if you can't come to terms on the particular language that might be used, so be it. But I think that the outcome is a strong one, and I think sends a very powerful message.
All right. And from your point of view, Michelle, you were totally on board. I take it you would agree that as a statement of the Parliament's, intent, it's pretty powerful.
Absolutely, and I just want to pay tribute to Bridget. She's been a leading voice in this campaign to have Julian freed. And, from my perspective, speaking as a doctor, I see a man who is about my age, who is showing all the signs of premature aging. As you know, he's had a couple of mini strokes, I believe, which have been reported publicly, and I'm very concerned about his health. And I think that, he has 2 small children at home, and he should be returned to Australia to live out his life with his children.
Yeah. All right. Well, look, that will be noted overseas. I'm sure the motion of the Australian Parliament. Your sitting fortnight is over, and I think you both got flights to get to. Bridget Archer, Michelle Ananda-Rajah, appreciate it, particularly at the end of a busy fortnight.